Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Climate change is affecting the Arctic in many ways, but one thing it's likely to do is bring increased shipping and trade through areas that were previously cut off by ice. Let me just give you an example. Now, if you had a ship full of goods in a port like Dalian in northeastern China, and you want to get them to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, right now, most likely, you'd sail around China and then west through the very busy Straits of Malacca off Indonesia, then across the Indian Ocean, up through the Red Sea past Egypt, through the Suez Canal, west all the way past Spain, and then back northeast through the Atlantic and the English Channel, finally to Rotterdam. But a new sea lane is opening up as we speak. This is the Northern Sea Route, where you'd leave China and sail north through the Bering Strait between Russia and Alaska into the Arctic, and then west all the way along northern Russia to Europe, a trip a bit more than half the distance than going through Suez. Now, back in August, a Russian-owned tanker carrying liquefied natural gas made this trip from Norway to South Korea, the first time a ship of this kind did so without an icebreaker. Now, this route is still closed by ice much of the year, but that ice is thawing rapidly. Russian President Vladimir Putin hopes it will transport lots of Russian petro products and eventually become the Suez of the North. On this edition of Global Journalist, a look at the future of the Arctic and how rising temperatures will herald not just changes in the environment, but trade as well. In a few minutes, we'll hear from a great panel of experts to talk about some of these changes. First, we're going to bring in Karen Thomas. She's the editor of the trade publication LNG World Shipping and has been covering the story of this new route between Russia and East Asia extensively. Karen, welcome.
Nice to be here.
Well, you've been to this remote part of northern Russia where there is this big new gas field on what's called the Yamal Peninsula, where Russia is hoping to ship a lot of gas out through the Arctic. Tell us just a bit about what it's like up there.
No, I think you've been misinformed. I've never actually been to Yamal LNG or to the Yamal Peninsula. I'm covering this story very much from London in the UK.
Oh, good. I'm sorry about that. Well, Karen Thomas, if you would, tell us just a little bit then about what the significance of this route is for some of these big new gas developments that are going on in Russia right now.
Sure. To start the story at the beginning, we write about liquefied natural gas and its transport from point of production to end buyer. And Russia is expanding massively its production in Arctic waters. Beginning at the end of this year, possibly fairly soon, we'll see the first cargoes shipped out of Yamal LNG on the Yamal Peninsula in northern Russia. Most of these cargoes are contracted to buyers in Asia. And the normal way of things would be for all that cargo to sail southbound towards Europe and then to transship in France or in Holland to travel via the Suez Canal to Asia. Now, what we're seeing as a proposal is that 15 ice-breaking LNG carriers have been ordered against this project. And these 15 ships, at least in theory, could in summer sail over the north of Russia to Asia. And the difference in journeys is comparing a journey via Suez of about 14,000 nautical miles against a journey of 8,000 nautical miles going over the top of Russia. So evidently it's a much shorter journey and one that could cut a sailing time of more than a month to just a couple of weeks. Now the question is, will this happen? In winter this would be impossible because the Arctic ice is too thin. What we've seen since 2007 is that global warming has thinned the Arctic waters in summer. And so these ice-breaking carriers, these 15 newly built ships, will in theory be able to cut through the summer ice, which is only a couple of meters deep, and sail without an icebreaker escort directly over Russia to Asia. What we don't know at this stage is whether this is what the ship owners are planning.
Well, I was reading the history of this shipping route because Russians have been sailing it or trying to sail it for hundreds of years. And some of the stories are quite interesting. The explorers, sometimes it would take them 2 or 3 years to go through this route because their ships would literally get frozen in ice on the way, and they'd have to stay there until the shipping lanes warmed and were open at least for a few days or weeks each year. And so sometimes they'd only proceed for a few days a year and then they get frozen in again. So how long is this route really going to be open and viable at this point?
We think that the summer season, I think that all the expert opinion is that the Arctic Sea route could feasibly at the moment be open to shipping from about July to October, November. So it's a very short time frame at the moment. Obviously, if the ice continues to thin at the rate it has been, at some point we could be looking at open waters, but we're certainly not at that point yet. And so what you're looking at is we had a maiden voyage this summer by an LNG carrier owned by Sovcomflot, the Russian ship owner. And this ship, called Christophe de Margerie, sailed over the top of Russia within, I think, 21 days to South Korea. And in doing so, it became the first LNG carrier to do this trip without an icebreaker, winter or summer. This is an important test case because I think, as you mentioned at the top of the program, Russia is very keen to develop a Suez of the North. And so Christophe de Margerie has very much completed a landmark voyage.
Well, tell us, if you would, about some of the other prospects for development there. You mentioned that there is this big new gas field on the Yamal Peninsula in sort of the Russian Northwest Arctic that's coming online. But there are other oil and gas projects in the pipeline as well. Tell us about those.
Sure. To give a sense of scale, maybe, we did some research a couple of years ago into the most expensive LNG projects in the world. And Yamal LNG is the fifth most expensive project on our list. This is an enormous project. We're talking 16.5 million tons of LNG a year. We're talking a $27 billion investment. And the reason I bring that up is that Novatek, the company that developed this project, is talking about a second lookalike project in the same area. So if that project goes ahead, and Russia seems to be pushing ahead with it quite aggressively, we could see a second project very soon, maybe by the end of the 2020s, that again needs 50 nice-class LNG carriers to bring the LNG to market. So we're talking really about a plan to double capacity in this one region of Siberia.
And so it sounds like at least for LNG, for liquefied natural gas, there is going to be more traffic on this route, particularly in the future. Talk to us just a bit about, some of the environmental risks incumbent in this. I mean, the ships are obviously sailing in very remote areas. The environment, because there aren't many humans around, is pristine in many ways. Many of our listeners will remember the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska, where you had enormous environmental damage here. Could something like that happen there?
To really begin with your question at the beginning, we don't know whether these LNG carriers will go over the top of Russia. We recently interviewed one of the 4 ship owners about their plans for delivering cargoes to Asia. And having initially said that, yes, the vessels would travel in convoys of 3 or 4 ships over Russia to Asia, they then backtracked and said that that was only one of the possibilities on offer during the summer sailing season. And I think it's really interesting, actually, that one of the Japanese ship owners has ordered a group of conventional non-ice-breaking LNG carriers with a view to shipping from France or the Netherlands through the Suez Canal to Asia. In terms of the risks, this is very, very, very interesting indeed. LNG shipping takes pride in being a very safe industry. Touch wood, there have been no major incidents involving an LNG carrier. What you have is gas carried at very, very low pressure so that it's liquefied. And in the event of a breach of the cargo containment system, in theory, the cargo should just escape into the atmosphere. Very bad in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, less so in terms of the kind of oil slicks that the Exxon Valdez created. What you really have is a question of remoteness. We were interviewing this ship owner and asked about the kind of support and backup that was available in the Russian Arctic. Russia has its own fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers that are available in the event of an accident or some kind of incident of maybe engine failure. And so there's a pledge that exists that Russia could make that backup available within 72 hours. If, on the other hand, you had a crew member taken sick, maybe an accident on board, a case of appendicitis, there are no emergency rescue services available to civilians in northern Russia. Russia has a network of
Karen,
10...
I'm sorry, we're just about out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. But it does sound like some of the risks are causing ship owners to think twice about this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
If you've just tuned in, this is Global Journalist. On today's show, we're talking about the future of the Arctic and how melting polar ice is affecting trade, the environment, and people in the region. We just spoke with Karen Thomas of the trade publication LNG World Shipping about the opening of the northern sea route across Russia's Arctic, connecting Europe to East Asia. To broaden our discussion now, we're going to bring in three other guests who have been tracking this issue closely. Joining us from Edmonton is Ed Struzik. He's a fellow at the Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy at Queen's University in Canada. He's also author of the recent book Future Arctic, Field Notes from a World on the Edge. In Arkhangelsk, Russia, at the edge of the Arctic Circle is Alexei Gnitsikov. He's an extractive industries environmental policy officer at the World Wildlife Fund's Russia program. And in Boston, Massachusetts is Ryan Uljua. He's a research associate who studies mining, tourism, and shipping at the Arctic Institute. Welcome to all of you. Ed Struzik, let me start with you. You've been traveling to the Arctic for decades. What's changed the most, just from your personal observations?
Well, the biggest thing is ice. Summer ice is disappearing very quickly, but I say that with caution because I was supposed to be up the Arctic this summer on a tall ship, an American tall ship, and had we gone, it was postponed, we would have been stuck because there's an enormous amount of ice. So the ice is disappearing, but it's still a big threat to shipping.
And what about with respect to humans that live in the area and with respect to animals, plant life, wildlife?
Well, we're seeing, a variety of southern species migrating into the Arctic, and those Arctic species now are becoming increasingly threatened. The polar bears, narwhal, beluga whale, those specialists that really are ice creatures are having a tough time adapting. And so we're in this transitional period. The old Arctic that we know very well is disappearing very quickly, and a new Arctic is unfolding. And what that new Arctic is going to look like, and nobody really can say for sure, where it really is, I think, a future that's going to be full of big surprises.
And Alexei Gnitsikov, we talked with Karen Thomas about this big new LNG facility on the Yamal Peninsula above the Arctic Circle in northern Russia. From your vantage point, what sorts of environmental issues do projects like these raise?
Yeah, we have a few real big concern about this project and other projects with shipping our oil and gas from Arctic. And actually, this Ob River mouth, where Port Sabeta now developed as a first point to transport LNG, is a very important area in terms of fish stock and marine mammals. And what we see now, in few months, it will be huge increase in shipping. So disturbance and even collision with marine mammals could be first issue that we raise.
So collisions with whales, in other words, then?
Yeah. But what another issue in terms of accidents and spills, everybody understands that LNG maybe is not so dangerous if any accident will occur. But we should understand that this project, Yamal LNG, is not only about natural gas. They also have a lot of condensate. This is actually liquid. And if it will be spilled in the Arctic condition, it could be a very dangerous situation. And actually, our scientists even couldn't produce any assessment or model what will happen if condensate will spill in ice conditions in the Arctic.
So if gas is transported in this other form and condensate, you're saying this increase a lot more risks in the event of a spill.
Yes, we think it's very big risk, and actually not a lot of science available, not only in Russia but in other Arctic states, to understand what will happen if condensate will spill in Arctic conditions.
Well, let me turn this to you, Ryan Oljua. We've been talking about this northern sea route across northern Russia, but of course, there's a route across North America as well, what's been known for hundreds of years as the Northwest Passage across northern Canada and Alaska, linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Tell us about the feasibility of commercial shipping along that route.
Sure. Well, to jump back for a moment, we've been talking about the Northern Sea Route as this potential Suez of the North. And I think that's a little misnomer here. What we're really talking about is moving resources out of northern Russia via the sea. That's different than the Suez of the North, meaning a transshipment route from Asia to Europe, for example. So I'd like to just throw that out there as a slight difference in what we're talking about. What we're really speaking about is Russian exports via the Arctic. The Northern Sea Route, compared to the Northwest Passage, I tend to be skeptical of either becoming a transshipment route, a transit route. Just the unpredictability of ice right now. Shipping costs are currently low. The price of oil is low. The main drivers that you would look for shipping companies to look for alternative routes to the Suez or the Cape of Good Hope aren't there right now. The two things I could see maybe picking up interest in either the Northern Sea Route or the Northwest Passage, obviously a spike in the price of oil, and B, the interest of China, specifically COSCO, the Chinese shipping company.
Well, Ed Struzek, talk to us just a bit. We've heard about Russian developments in the Arctic. What about Canada's interest in developing oil and gas in this area? Are there big projects in store? Is this something that is likely to increase in the future?
Well, they've been searching for 40 years and they haven't shipped a barrel of oil out of the Arctic, a commercial barrel of oil out of the Arctic. Really, it's just not economically feasible at this time, especially with these prices. The main thing that's been driving it is government subsidies. The other big problem is that we have no ports in either Alaska or Arctic Canada from which to stage some of these developments and from which to do search and rescue or oil spill cleanups. The infrastructure just isn't there. We've got also an aging fleet of icebreakers in Canada and almost none in the United States. It's so bad that the Coast Guard here declares nicknames the mother of the fleets, the Joan Rivers icebreaker, because she's had so many makeups over the years. So we're just not ready for this.
Well, Alexei Nitsikov, talk to us about the Northern Sea Route across northern Russia. What's the legal framework governing the environmental rules along this route? You talked about some of the risks, particularly from gas being transported in condensate form, that if there was a spill, it could be quite significant, quite difficult to clean up. Who's in charge of enforcing that the right precautions are being taken?
Yeah, here in Russia we have Russian version of Coast Guard as you have in US. So a Russian agency under the Ministry of Transportation who is responsible for accidents, oil spills. And that's true that we still don't have enough capacity along the Northern Sea Route. But at the same time, in Ob River mouth, this agency already established some capacity for clean up oil spills. But I totally agree with other experts that there is no effective technology for clean up oil in ice condition in Arctic. So that's the real issue. And for instance, what could be a solution from our point of view? Just to make changes in fuel for shipping and use LNG, not heavy fuel oil, as a fuel for Arctic ships. It could be a real solution to avoid such disasters.
So in other words, just changing the fuel that powers the ship would significantly reduce the environmental risks of a shipwreck where the ship's own fuel would spill into the sea, much less its cargo.
Yes, that's true.
A reminder that this is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. If you've just tuned in, we're talking about the future of the Arctic today and how melting ice is affecting oil and gas production, shipping, and the environment. We're joined from Edmonton, Alberta by Ed Struzik of Queen's University, from Arkhangelsk, Russia by Alexei Nitsikov of the World Wildlife Fund, and from Boston by Ryan Uljua of the Arctic Institute. If you're interested in more coverage of underreported international news, visit us at globaljournalist.org. You can also connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the videocast of this program on YouTube. Ryan Uljua, go ahead. I know you want to jump in on a point there.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Going back to the regulatory framework governing the Northern Sea Route, 2017 saw the entry into force of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code, which governs, theoretically, the operation of any commercial ship in the Arctic and Antarctic waters. How Russia, which has its own framework for safety and environmental concerns in shipping on the Northern Sea Route, how Russia reconciles the Polar Code and integrates it into its own domestic code is going to be a really interesting area to watch moving forward.
Well, Ryan, you spoke previously about sort of this Northern Sea Route development being driven by Russia's need to export goods, but there's obviously a buyer. What are China's interests in the development of the Arctic? Right now, much of China's energy supply comes through the Malacca Straits between Indonesia and Malaysia. Very, very busy shipping route. If something were to go wrong there, China could be in difficult circumstances.
Sure, the Malacca dilemma, as it's known. From China's perspective, sourcing energy, diversification is the name of the game. And the Northern Sea Route is just yet another source that's, in addition to overland pipelines, it's a diversification away from Malacca. And I think from China's perspective, any option is worth exploring if they can diversify away from Malacca.
Well, the other thing I think that we need to consider is that the Arctic is opening up to commercial fishing, and the Chinese are very interested in exploiting that fishery. Greenland now has a commercial fishery. There's a commercial fishery opening up north of Iceland, and everybody's now looking at the Central Arctic Ocean as a potential commercial fishery down the road. And so China is as a fishing nation, is deeply interested in this, and that's one of the reasons why they're in the Arctic.
And Ed Struzik, now, if I understand from your book that you had written, you saw 2007 as sort of a tipping point in the change of the Arctic. Why is that?
Well, that was the year that we saw ice recede like it never had before. And it caught everybody's attention. And since then, we've been breaking records almost every other year. 2012, we had the strongest summer storm ever recorded in the North American Arctic. This year, we had near record sea ice loss in the Arctic, except for Arctic Canada. Since then, we've been constantly surprised. No one has been able to anticipate just how quickly things have been changing. What we do know is that it is changing dramatically. And right now we need a roadmap for the future, and it really is not a very clear one.
Alexei Nitsikov, from your perspective in Arkhangelsk, how do you see things changing over the next several years there? What is this part of the world? Is it going to look like in 3 years from now, 5 years from now?
We expect huge increase in use Northern Sea Route, but not as a transit route, but destination route. A lot of new project from extractive industry is developing now all along the Russia. It's not only oil and gas, it's also coal, metals, and everybody like to use ships to sell these resources to Europe or to Asia. So currently, last year, we already achieved the volumes of cargo across the Northern Sea Route that was achieved in Soviet Union. And there are different estimations about upcoming years, but by 2030, we should expect 3 or 5 times increase in volume of cargo along the Northern Sea Route.
And Ryan Uljua, we've heard a lot about the economic development that's taking place in northern Russia based around being able to get resources out through the Arctic. You've talked about an icebreaker gap, something that Ed Struzik had touched on earlier between U.S. and Russia. I guess that's sort of a nod to the missile gap during the Cold War. Talk to us about why this sort of icebreaker gap issue is significant.
Sure. I don't personally like to use the term icebreaker gap. I think it does bring back a little too many Cold War memories. But there's certainly a difference in the number of icebreakers operated by the U.S. and Russia. Probably, depending on how you slice it, you're looking at a 40 icebreaker fleet for Russia and 2 functioning ones for the U.S. People see those numbers and they get a little concerned. I'd like to just remind people that Russia has far more coastline in the Arctic, far more economic interest in the Arctic than the U.S. has, and the geography of Russia simply lends itself to the need for icebreakers. You have rivers emptying into the Arctic that need to be cleared, and that sort of thing that you just don't see in Alaska. So sure, the U.S. does have an issue, as Ed mentioned, so does Canada, with renewing its fleet of icebreakers, but so does Russia. Russia's fleet is much larger by necessity, and it's also aging as well. So how Russia funds the development of new icebreakers, particularly heavy icebreakers, both nuclear and conventionally powered, that's going to be interesting to watch how the Russian government prioritizes those in their budget.
Well, Ed Struzik, let me ask you about the lives of indigenous people in this area. It's not a heavily populated area, but there are people who have lived there for thousands and thousands of years that have been quite cut off from much of the rest of the world. How have you seen that their lives are changing?
Well, for one thing, without sea ice, they have no platform from which to hunt whales and seals and other marine mammals, and so it's become increasingly dangerous for them. And a lot of these marine mammals now are hauling out in other places, such as walrus. Polar bears now in the Beaufort Sea are moved so far north that they've almost stopped hunting them. And so there's a food security issue. It's a huge one. In fact, there have been sort of a number of emergency calls to send food up to Alaskan and Canadian communities to help them augment their food supplies. So they're really in a state of flux and quite concerned about the future. And so they're torn between this idea of having more economic development that will be fueled to some extent by shipping, and preserving the lifestyles that they have, which depend on caribou, marine mammals. And there are just no easy answers right now. And I think that maybe is one of the things that we should be concerned about most before we start getting ahead of the game, especially in the North American Arctic, about resource development, both the oil and gas and mining.
And Alexei Nitsikov, our time does grow short, but this area of northern Russia right now, where the large gas facility on the Yamal Peninsula is being opened up, has been a very pristine region. There are hundreds of thousands of reindeer there. You describe rivers full of fish, eating fresh fish for lunch yourself. How do you think this, from an environmental perspective, this part of northern Siberia is going to change in the coming years?
Yeah, once again, we think that we shouldn't expect too much impact on reindeer's population, because what we have now, for instance, on Yamal Peninsula, we have quite big population of reindeers. At the same time, we have many years for development of gas field there by Gazprom and now by Novatec. So I think we're now focusing more to protect fresh water in Opi River.
That's all we have for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and KBIA Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Karen Thomas, Ed Struzik, Alexei Nitsikov, and Ryan Uljua for joining us. Our assistant producers are Denitsa Tsikova, Maria Caleon, Yankizu, and Anne-Marie Welser, with supervising producer Rachel Foster Gimbel. Elisa Bile is visual editor. Travis McMillan is studio director. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.